Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Very warm welcome to all of you this evening. These are the minutes from the ordinary meeting Thursday, the 15th of February, 2024. Online only. Professor Martin Millett, President in the Chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 8th of February, 2024 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society. The materiality and historical dress, early modern hunting, an interdisciplinary approach by Dr. Dustin M. Neighbors. Thanks for return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be Thursday, 22nd of February, 2024, then adjourn the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as true and complete record? Thank you. Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes desires to be admitted a fellow. Anthony Tony Crosby. Will you come forward, Tony?
Anthony.
Thank you.
Anthony, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome and congratulations. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting to hear a lecture from Dr. David Gwynn. David is an historian of the industrial and modern period. He's actively involved in the railway heritage movement, and you'll have seen his book outside, true scholarly expression of that work. He serves as trustee of the Festiniog Railway and is chairman of the Bala Lake Railway Company. He's talking to us this evening on the subject covered by his book, Iron Road, Writing the History of the Railway from 1750 to 1850. David, welcome.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, fellows of the Society of Antiquaries, distinguished guests, friends. It's a great pleasure to come to speak to you this evening about this book, what I wrote. Though since the book is available for sale and has been published for a little while now, what I'm inclined to share with you is something of the process of writing the book itself, how it got to be written, what prompted me to write it, what the process of writing a book about the early iron railway actually involves. I can't help feeling that since books on railways include The Little Engine That Could and Thomas the Tank Engine, it sometimes requires a little bit of scholarly justification for inflicting yet another publication on the history of the railway in any way, shape or form on a long-suffering public. But bear with me for about 40 minutes or so, and we'll see where we go with this. The remark was made to me recently that an historian should get his or her boots dirty. And if nothing else, whatever merits or demerits I may have as an historian, I've got my boots dirty in studying railways because I'm still trying to recover from a day on the footplate on Tuesday where the coal was dreadful. Just because it's South Wales steam coal doesn't mean it's any good. And it poured with rain and we were slipping up the bank and it was extremely windy. I suppose it'll be obvious to you that an interest in railways has been with me for a very long time. And the reason I think I became fascinated by this transport system has to do with where we lived when I was a small child, which is in the village, or some would say the town of Bethesda, in what was then Carnarvonshire, where, lucky little boy that I was, I had a standard gauge branch line that came up from Bangor Station about 100 yards in front of the house. And once a day, a very grubby tank locomotive would come up from Bangor with a single coal wagon and a brake van to take coal to Bethesda Gasworks. And on the other side of the valley, so about a quarter of a mile away, there was the Quarry Railway, which was a 2-foot gauge operation, still steam worked. So all my life, I've been fascinated by the varieties of railway engineering and the functions and purposes of railways. Now, I have to say at this stage, I have never been a train spotter. Have you all got that? I have never been a train spotter. And I think one reason I never became a train spotter was that I could see absolutely no reason, strictly speaking, of course, one is a locomotive spotter, were one to be such a thing. But there was no point, if you'd seen the Penryn Railway in operation, taking down the numbers of the locomotives, because they didn't have any. They had names, as proper steam locomotives do, and once you'd seen Blanche pulling a train, all you could do was wait for Linda to pull a train. And once you'd seen Linda pulling a train, well, you just had to wait for Blanche to pull a train. So that seemed to me to be quite sufficient and did not justify me buying a notebook and going out and recording the numbers of British Railway Standard Class 460s and 280s and 264s. No, didn't know anything at all about them, didn't care for them. Well, the early iron railway, distinguished historians still tend to say that the first railway was, doing this wrong, aren't I? Technology is not my strong point. There we go, there we go. Yes, distinguished historians, some of them, they need not be named, still say that the first railway was the Stockton and Darlington in the northeast of England. And they then go on to tell us that the second railway was the Liverpool and Manchester. Stockton and Darlington opened in 1825. The Liverpool and Manchester opened 5 years later in 1830. It doesn't stop there. People who should know better really don't seem to me to have grasped the fact that the railway is quite an ancient technology. Let me give you an example from the recent Welsh encyclopedia, which describes the first proper railway in Wales as being the Taff Vale Railway, which opened in 1841. In which case, I'm an historian of improper railways, and improper subjects are always of compelling interest to all of us, but I will endeavour to maintain the proprieties this evening. The Liverpool and Manchester was, I would have to say, a step change from the Stockton and Darlington. The same personnel, in many cases, involved with both. But whereas the Stockton and Darlington was a Quaker undertaking, some would say even pre-capitalist in the way that it was financed and constructed. It mainly carried coal, it carried some passengers, but in horse-drawn stagecoach-like vehicles. And the Liverpool and Manchester really was the first recognisable modern mainline railway. It was of the Liverpool and Manchester that distinguished historian Sir Arthur Elton, documentary filmmaker, said it was one of those moments at its opening, an epochal change, when the old world really gave way to the new world. It was opened by the Duke of Wellington. It managed to kill one of its principal guests on its opening day, former cabinet minister. It was architecturally flamboyant, as you can see from this splendid Moorish arch. Its locomotives were new and innovative. They established the design path that was really the one continued until the end of steam, effectively in the 1950s and 1960s, and it ran some very fancy carriages indeed. It was a symbolic achievement as much as a mechanical achievement. Had our artist depicting the Moorish arch turned round through 180 degrees, this is what he would have seen, because what I showed you a moment ago was not actually the terminus of the railway at all. It was the point at which passenger train services began. The railway actually began on the quays at Liverpool, and wagons were hauled up by rope, by steam engines, not locomotives, fixed engines, through this long tunnel, the first tunnel to run, railway tunnel to run underneath the city. And you can see there the chimneys of the two fixed engines, but a deliberate echo for those of you who know your 17th century scientific philosophy of the motif of the columns of Hercules that Francis Bacon employed in his Novum Organum. This was the symbol of access to the sea, access to new learning, access to the great wide world, and one that I've no doubt appealed very much to Liverpool merchants with a lot of money to spend, a lot of money acquired, I'd have to say, from some very dubious sources indeed. More on that story later, but anxious to join the British political and financial elite, which is what happened. One of them was the father of a young man, still, I think, at Oxford at the time, called William Ewart Gladstone. Now, it had been my original intention when I first made the suggestion of this book to Yale University Press that I should end in 1834, which is the point at which it really became clear that the locomotive-worked iron railway was the way forward, that the road and the canal both had much to offer. One has to remember, of course, in Britain at least, an awful lot of capital had only very recently gone into improving the road system, the turnpikes, and in creating the canal system. And now investors were being asked to put money into something completely different. So really, this was going to be my original terminus ad quem, showing a Liverpool and Manchester train on its way to Manchester, a train approaching towards Liverpool in the distance. You can just about see it under the bridge, and a coal train on the St. Helens and Drunken Gap Railway, making its way down to a wharf on the Mersey River. That was my initial intention. And my initial intention was to start it with these wooden ways, so-called wooden wagon ways, which were based very much in the northeast of England. Now, to my mind, one of the most compelling pieces of railway history ever written is Dr. Michael Lewis's study of the early wooden railway. There were, by the end of the 18th century, hundreds of miles of wooden railway in existence in the United Kingdom. It looks a primitive, crude type of system, the Parkmore Wagonway here coming down to a stave on the River Tyne, but it was very well suited indeed to the circumstances of the northeast of England coal trade, and similar systems operated in the Severn Valley area around Coldbrookdale, Ironbridge, and where to be found elsewhere. So the notion that the railway only comes into being with the Stephensons and the Stockton and Darlington is totally erroneous. What there hadn't been so far was a comprehensive history of that transition period. How does a railway running on wooden rails, making use of animal traction and making use of single wooden wagons, no such thing as a train here, just one wagon with a man smoking a pipe and keeping the brake on by sitting on it. How does that become, well, how does that become this? This was my original stopping point. This is the Dublin and Kingstown Railway, a Quaker enterprise, an interesting one because it ran from the back of that well-known centre of the Anglo-Irish Protestant establishment, Trinity College, Dublin. Its terminus, which we see here, was right next to a new and flamboyant Catholic church, because these are the years just after Catholic emancipation, and it was a Quaker enterprise. That should, I think, alert us to the fact that the Iron Railway, the Iron Road, comes into being at a time of very fundamental political and economic change. So that was going to be my terminus at Quem, but Yale said to me, no, if you publish a book that says it's the history of the railway from 1767, the first iron rails of all, to 1834, people will say, what's so important about 1767 and what's so important about 1834? And I thought, well, okay, maybe they've got a point. So they said, take it from 1750 to 1850. So I looked around for something important that had happened in 1750. And all I could find was a patent drawn out by an Edinburgh lawyer for an inclined plane. So that had to do. 1850 was a lot easier, really. You know, 1850 comes just after 1848. I mean, I know that's fairly obvious, but what I'm saying is, of course, it comes after that revolutionary period, and people can perhaps begin to think about investing once again. I did also acknowledge the fact that the railway is much, much older even than our Newcastle wagonways. Now, this is the Diolkos of Corinth, a railway built in, I think I'm right in saying, the 6th century BC. I hope there are no classicists here that can challenge me, by this chap on the right, Periander, the tyrant of Corinth. And you may say, well, you know, it's a stone railway. It's not really a proper railway. Well, you know, what's wrong with that? What's a railway? A railway is a prepared way which offers both support and guidance to wheeled vehicles. And I will be showing you some other stone railways from much more recent times in just a bit. This was what we call a portage railway. It's gone down in history as one that carried warships over, I can never say this word, isthmus, you know, one of those necks of land between two bigger bits of land. You know what I'm saying, but if I try saying it properly, I'll just be with you all evening. Also, there seems to be evidence for railways in a Roman mining context. This is Tres Minas mine in Portugal, and what we are looking here is, I'm told, it's the Galeria de los Alargamentos. My apologies to those of you who speak Portuguese fluently, but it is a Roman mine railway. It is so called because there are places within it where loops were installed, these carved ruts, to allow wagons to pass. Now, so far, and to the best of my knowledge, it is the only Roman mine railway of which evidence has come to light. But bearing in mind the extent to which the Roman Empire was very much a one-size-fits-all type of undertaking, it would be highly unlikely if there were not other examples of stone-cut mine railways to be found elsewhere in the Roman Empire. What we are perhaps a little bit more certain about is the development of systems such as this. Again, a mine railway. This particular example is from eastern France, Croix-aux-Mines. The illustration dates from the early to middle 16th century, and it shows a type of railway that was very, very common in Central European mining sets from, we're not quite sure when, but in some instances into the 1920s. These tiny wagons, which don't have flanged wheels, they have a guide pin in between. You can see them being pushed into the mine there. And we can be relatively certain that it was a system such as this that provided the first railway in Britain in a copper mine near Keswick in the 1560s, because archaeological evidence has come to light. And we know that the mine was set up by experienced German investors, well, from the Holy Roman Empire and from the Free Imperial City of Augsburg. So a clear technology transfer there from continental Europe. British traditions of railway building, well, by the 18th century, the late 18th century, we are thoroughly in the grip, not just of a coal industrial revolution, but an iron industrial revolution as well. This painting by the Swiss artist de Lutterburg shows a wooden railway at Coalbrookdale near Ironbridge in 1801, another centre along with the northeast of England of these early wooden railways. But I mentioned a stone Roman railway a little while ago. Here is a much more modern stone railway, Hay Tor in the West Country, where the rails are made of the same stones that were quarried and sent down to the Stover Canal. So we're witnessing from the end of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century, a very fertile experimental period in railway technology. Now, in fact, some people have gone so far as to describe these as experimental railways. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. A railway is anything that works. It's a railway that works, you know, and stones and wood were perfectly effective means of creating the system that we now recognize as a railway. One aberration in railway history, which becomes particularly common in this period, however, is the plateway. You'll notice that the rails here are the ones with the flange, not the wheel. So those rails are L-section cast iron pieces. It is the rails that keep the wheels on the rails. It is not the flange on the wheels that do the guiding. And this is a system that comes into being in the 1780s and proved extremely popular, very effective, one would have to say, in South Wales, Southeast Wales. It's an interesting and salutary thought that by the early years of the 19th century, far and away the densest network of railways in the world was in fact in Southeast Wales. And in fact, that became the case again at the beginning of the First World War, when the need to move coal, steam coal, to serve the British Empire was paramount. But already when the economy of South Wales was depending very much on iron, these iron railways came to be constructed. And here's a splendid painting of just such a system. It's actually a detail of the painting, which shows the inaugural run of some, I won't go into the details because, you know, anybody who's just denied being a train spotter is just dying to tell you about some technological features. But this shows some articulated bogie wagons being put to use for the first time. Now, when you next travel on a train, if you're not a railway person, just have a look at the system of articulation under the carriages. This is the first time such a system was used. And again, Southeast Walian ingenuity. It pains me to say that, of course. I mean, I'm from the Northwest, but one has to give the South Walian his due. The technology comes from Central Europe, but goes back to Central Europe as well in an interesting sort of way. Now, when, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria, realized that he was having to govern a very, very diverse collection of different nationalities, he realized that he had a job to do. The trouble with Metternich was that he hated anything new at all. He hated political innovation and he hated technology. So it wasn't Metternich's decision by any means to build a part wooden, part iron strapped railway connecting the Czech or Bohemian heartlands with the Danube River. But that's what we're looking at here. This is the Budweis to Linz horse railway, which was completed in 1834. And it's again, if you like the Daukos of Corinth, the portage railway. It connected the Altava, which feeds into I'm going to say, does it flow into the North Sea or the Baltic? I think the North Sea. And the Danube, which of course flows in the other direction. It was the first railway to unite two different great continental watersheds. Quite a story behind its construction. Its engineer, well, basically made a complete mess of the man management aspect of building a railway. Technology is easy. You know, I think if you get sufficient engineers and you've got enough money, you can build a railway anywhere. You can build a railway to Lhasa. It's been done. What is unpredictable is the human element in railway building. A friend of mine was saying he read railway engineering. He said he was told by his professor, the problem is not going to be a locomotive coming off the rails. It's not going to be a bridge collapsing. The problem is going to walk into your office on two legs. And that is very true. Nevertheless, the railway gets built. Something else that I must admit, when I started researching this study, I wasn't entirely prepared for, was the extent to which railways and roads and canals actually overlapped with each other. Now, this is the Morris Canal in the eastern part of the United States. You can see that they very wisely decided here that they wouldn't bother with locks, which are a very time-consuming way of lifting barges. They would actually put the barges on rope-hauled, railed sections, and that is how they would move them. So railways and canals, though they appear to be great rivals in this period, actually work together and indeed overlap with each other. You have canal barges on railway wheels, for instance. You have barges that are put onto railway wagons, and very much the same engineers who were building both. Now, of course, the breakthrough technologies of this period of the Iron Railway, one was undoubtedly the coming of the iron rail, but the other one was the availability of what were called locomotive engines. Now, steam is first of all applied to railway operation in fixed engine form to wind vehicles up gradients. The locomotive probably comes into existence as a practical technology. Merthyr Tydfil in 1804, there had been earlier attempts to build locomotives, but we associate the early years of locomotive technology with the Cornishman Trevithick, who in 1808 displayed a locomotive at a circus somewhere near where University College London is situated now. Attempts have been made to pinpoint the exact location, and I don't think they've been successful. I'm very sorry to have to tell you that the alleged Rowlandson print that depicts it is a fake. It nevertheless looks so convincing, and I think is reasonably accurate that I included it nonetheless. Now, Trevithick not only exhibited this locomotive in London, he offered also to race it against any horse at Newmarket. Now, that would have been something to watch, but it never happened. Trevithick got into a bit of a huffy fit about the whole thing. And it's really only with the construction, well, not of this particular machine, because this is a modern replica of Puffing Billy at the beginning of the, well, 1815 or thereabouts, that the locomotive becomes a practical technology. An experimental phase is over, and Puffing Billy and her sister or sisters, somebody called Billy can really be a female person, they established the practicality, they and a few others, around about the same time, established the practicality of locomotive operation. But it is, of course, with the Stephensons that we associate the coming of the locomotive on the Iron Road. I've spent a long time trying to work out what this painting is actually trying to tell us. The location can be easily identified. It's Killingworth. The level crossing is still there. Killingworth Colliery in the background, and the main line to the north in the far background. That's the Stephenson family. George Stephenson evidently wearing that, really rather loud Ratcatcher suit, and his son Robert doing his best to show that a university education hasn't turned him into an intellectual softy, wearing a miner's hoggers. I find the Stephensons fascinating, and I find that any detailed study of this period of railway history, I think very much puts them back on their plinth. They were exceptional engineers. What's also interesting to my mind is the way that they benefited from patronage systems. The people who owned the collieries in the northeast of England, they of course wanted profit. They were very willing indeed to indulge the Stephensons, and other people like Timothy Hackworth, Nicholas Wood, the colliery viewers, the managers of the northeast of England collieries, were exceptionally able people. Timothy Hackworth, a locomotive builder and engineer, it's interesting that, well, he's a curious character. He was a devout Methodist, but he rode to hounds. He was fond of dancing, and he sent his daughter to be educated by the nuns in Vilvoorde, near Brussels. These men look like rough working men, but they weren't. They were the beneficiaries of a very sophisticated patronage system that recognized what they were doing, what they could offer, and gave them their head. Now, I said a little bit about the Austrian Empire. What about the United States? Well, the Baltimore and Ohio actually predates the Stockton and Darlington as the first recognizable main line, only by a few months, and it doesn't go for that flamboyant architectural ambition that the Liverpool and Manchester certainly does. You can see here that they built the station at Ellicott's Mills out of some old workmen's shanties, but there is the original terminus of this railway. It was to be many years before it connected the east coast of America with the Ohio River. It only got there in the 1850s. But what is interesting as well is that the Liverpool and Manchester, of course, serves the global industry of cotton. The Baltimore and Ohio served the food industry. It ran from the Maryland coast to the flour mills, Ellicott's Mills, a few miles inland. So the purposes to which railways are being put is different. American conditions required different types of technology as well. And here's a wonderful beast. This is the John Bull, built for the Camden and Amboy in Newcastle, England, in 1831. It's a standard Newcastle Stephenson Sampson type locomotive, except that when it got to the USA in bits, it had to be reconfigured. The mechanic who put it together had never seen a locomotive before. He knew what he was doing. He was a canny fellow, but it wasn't ideally suited to rough American track. America was very, very short of iron, and rails in America were very apt to be wooden with a thin iron strip on the top. Curves were sharper, So it needed an extra set of axles to guide it through the curves. So hence that projecting thing on the front. It's a technical term, projecting thing on the front. It needed a cow catcher because American railroads didn't have fences as a rule, and livestock tended to work on the track. So it's interesting to reflect that although we see the hand of the Stephensons in the steam railway, people in other parts of the world didn't adopt it without very carefully considering what elements to choose and what elements to reject, whether they're working in the Austrian Empire, whether they're working in the USA, whether for that matter they're working in France. And the design trajectory of the John Ball leads to locomotives like this, the Norris Brothers Tioga, I think one of the earliest photographs taken in the USA of a steam locomotive. And you can see, those of you who are devotees of Westerns can see the distinguishing features of the American Western locomotive taking shape there. The front bogie, the long, rather elegant design, somehow flimsier than a British version, but these were the locomotives that won the West. Won more than the West, I'd have to say, because here's a wonderful engraving of a sugar mill in Cuba. And what do we see in the foreground? Pride of place, but the locomotive that's going to take the output of the mill down to Havana. By the 1850s, the railway is spreading all over the world, and it's making its way to Russia. By the late 1840s, the Tsar, the most conservative man ever to sit on the throne of St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas, had nevertheless studied as an engineer and was actually rather intrigued by railways and gave his blessing to a railway from Moscow to St. Petersburg. And this is it. American-designed locomotives and carriages crossing the canal at St. Petersburg, very American wooden bridge. And where did the money to build this railway come from? Well, I rather thought that there'd be a lot of capital in St. Petersburg to build it, or maybe the City of London. No, apparently it came from Merthyr Tydfil. It is an astonishing thought, is it not, that in the late 1840s there should have been more money in Merthyr Tydfil than in St. Petersburg, but such seems to be the case. I mean, don't go to Merthyr Tydfil if you're looking for investment opportunities now. How does the steam locomotive first make its way to Russia? Well, here's an interesting story. The first locomotive in Russia was built a few years before for an ironworks railway in the Urals by a father and son who were both serfs. Despite being serfs, they were very highly valued employees of Count Demidov, who had the good fortune to be the richest man in the world at the time. And he sent the father over to look at a very early steam railway in Leeds. Bit of a difficult assignment for the serf in question, Mr. Cherepanov, because he couldn't speak a word of English. He had a beard, and he wore a kaftan and a visor. He was immediately arrested as a spy when he landed in Hull. He nevertheless had a look, went to Leeds, had a look at this railway, said, no, I don't think much of this. But then his son was sent over to assess the Liverpool and Manchester. His son couldn't speak a word of English either, but nevertheless carefully noted what he saw. He goes home and he and his father build this Stephenson-inspired locomotive. And they then built another one and it's sent to St. Petersburg for evaluation. It takes a while for the Tsar to come round to the idea, but come round he does. China. Many years ago, I remember leafing my way through Professor Joseph Needham's History of Technology in China, and I came across this. And I made a mental note that one day I would research it. It is the first locomotive in China, and it was built by an engineer in Guangzhou who had seen a model arrive on a ship from India and decided that he would build one himself. This is at a time when the Chinese are beginning to think that the detested barbarians have actually got some ideas worth investigating. And what Ding Gong Chen builds is a model locomotive that's based on British practice of about 10 years before. It's quite a while before an operating railway gets built in China, and the Japanese took the lead in terms of Asian countries. This is the Seiren Kata, which is a research institute. I won't go into all the details about the opening up of Japan to Western powers, but quite a number of Japanese noblemen were quite convinced that Japanese isolation had to come to an end quite shortly, and that they should do a bit of mugging up about what the technologies that Europeans might be offering could actually offer Japan. Now, isn't this a wonderful example of, this is train set as technology transfer? And the locomotive was based on an alcohol-fueled model bought them by a Russian admiral. But it was this particular railway, Yokohama, a few years later, that introduced Japan to the possibilities of Western technology. This arrived with Commodore Perry, his second visit to Japan. He brought with him lots of things: bourbon whiskey, for which the Japanese acquired a taste, I think, pretty much there and then, and railways, which they obviously thought were absolutely wonderful. Miniature railway, locomotive built by Norris, and Perry and the other American officers were pleased to see that these very sedate shoguns were absolutely delighted to be given a ride on this little train, not without some objection to the more conservative elements in Japanese society, but lo and behold, within a few years, railways are being built in Japan. I felt there was every obligation on me to tell the dark side of the railway story as well. Railways in the southern part of the USA prolonged servitude. Railways in Britain were constructed on the back of money invested in the slave trade, as was practically the whole of British industries, as far as I can make out. And here's a painting by the English painter Eyre Crowe, which shows enslaved people being removed from Richmond in Virginia to be put on the train and to be taken south. It's not just that railways were used to move enslaved people around. It's not just that the profits of the cotton industry prolonged servitude in the USA. Coerced labor was also used to build and maintain railways, men, women, and children in the southern states of the USA and in much of Central Europe. Serfdom, one has to remember, was still active in many parts in Congress Poland, in parts of the Austrian Empire, and many of the railways in these parts of the world were built by people who were wretchedly treated. It was hard work being a navvy on a British railway, but they were well paid, and they knew that they could move on to another contract. Well, we look at all these locomotives with their polished brass chimneys and all the rest of it, and we think, what a charming but now outdated technology. One has to remember, of course, that they made redundant a very new and briefly very profitable technology, the British, the American, and continental European road industry. This wonderful lithograph shows how the money that had gone into road transport systems was now going somewhere completely different. And from a heritage point of view, those of you who've been to the Northeast of England Museum in Beamish may have seen that when one of their historic stagecoaches was damaged in a fire a number of years ago, Excuse me. They decided that the most appropriate conservation system for this artifact was to throw it in the pond. It wasn't going to get much worse, and it could also bring to life the lithograph you have just seen. So there we have in the background, you can see the Pockley Colliery Railway with the wonderfully named steam elephant pulling a train, recreation of an 1820s landscape there, including, I might add, the gibbet, which you can see on the horizon, just above the stagecoach. A reminder that things were hard in those days, especially if you were a Luddite. But just as the railway itself came to be apparently superseded by road transport once again from the 1920s onwards, it did, of course, do great, if temporary, damage to an earlier and existing transport system. So I'll leave you with the thought that the heritage of early railways is in good hands, with museums up and down the country preserving, in some cases, replicating historic locomotives. Here is the Puffing Billy replica on a heritage railway in the Netherlands. I'll just say, by way of digression, this is one of the most surreal afternoons of my life. We had to propel the wagon, the carriage you see on the right, through a bit of Dutch suburbia, where I was assisted by a very tall, elderly Dutchman who wore a top hat and a frock coat and confused matters by addressing me in Welsh throughout. I never really got over that. But the truth is that when you next travel by train, I think you should reflect yourself that you're not traveling on a Victorian technology at all. You're actually traveling on a Hanoverian technology. You're traveling on a technology that really dates from a slightly earlier period of history, and that it is one that established a design path that has endured for a very, very long time indeed. If Robert Stevenson and his father had come back from the dead in 1960, they would have said, yeah, we get this. Not an awful lot has changed. The locomotives are bigger, they're smellier, they can go faster, they can go longer distances, but it is still in effect, that technology. So I would like to think that by writing a contribution towards the history of the coming of the railway between 1750 and 1850, it is also a contribution to the history of this wonderfully successful and compelling transport system that has now got a history going back well over 2.5 millennia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was a fascinating insight, and I must say your selection of illustrations was really, really very pleasing, particularly seeing things from coming right the way across the globe. The floor is open to questions, and I wonder whether I can sort of open up. You talked a little bit about the capital investment that went into this. Is there a change in the nature of capital that made this sort of revolution happen when it did? Or is it what's the cause and effect, so to speak?
That's a very good question. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking to microphones. You know, it's the dead generations of Wesleyan preachers in my family. I just think I should be able to broadcast from the pulpit. A great number of factors. I would say that one of them is the British banking system, which starts good after the Glorious Revolution. It gets better and better. It's able to pay the British government to go to war, 7 Years' War, middle of the 18th century. It attracts people like the Rothschilds. It is able to turn around vast sums of money in the Atlantic economy through the slave trade, through cotton, timber, all sorts of things. And it acquires during the Napoleonic period other refugee bankers and capitalists. So people could buy things. The other things we need to bear in mind is that the price of hay had gone up. Horses are very greedy animals, and they need an awful lot of land. Horses eat stuff, and humans need to eat stuff as well. Coal has the great advantage that it's underneath the earth, and it doesn't take up good farming land. Iron also becomes cheaper in the period we're talking about, and wood becomes more expensive.
Thank you.
That's a start.
Yeah, no, that gives us very beautiful context. Questions from the floor. If you raise your hand, Rebecca will bring a mic so that people online can hear. We've got some online questions, which take from the back.
Regarding the painting of the Stevenson family, the women are dressed very antiquated or old-fashioned dresses. Is the painting supposed to be portraying them in some kind of rustic mode, playing at peasantry, and the industrial background is symbolically showing the urban future?
Again, a very good question. It's very difficult to establish, or I have asked people who I thought would know, and they don't seem to know who the women are, but they may represent earlier generations of the family. Now, Robert Stevenson is shown as a very young man, and the locomotive dates from, let me get this right, I'm afraid there'll be an awful lot of people online who are waiting to pounce on any mistake I make. The locomotive dates from the late 1820s. So I think that the women are meant to show generations of the family who would have been around earlier in the Stevenson family history. So that might be it. Why is Robert Stevenson, who had spent terms at Edinburgh University, shown dressed as a miner? And why, for that matter, is George Stevenson wearing that bizarre suit? I really have asked several costume historians if they can enlighten me, and I remain so far unenlightened. So if anybody has got any bright ideas, do please let me know.
Any further questions or comments?
Why do you suppose the Moscow to St. Petersburg Railway used imported American rolling stock despite Russia having reverse engineered the steam locomotive and beginning its own domestic steam locomotive industry?
I think that the Cherepanovs weren't given the sort of patronage that would have made that possible. Now, the Tsar did relent to the extent of constructing a demonstration railway between St. Petersburg and Tsarskoye Selo somewhat earlier, which was much more a British thing. It was Timothy Hackworth's son who was sent out with the locomotive. The railway was largely useless because the only people who travelled on it were sightseeing noblemen, but it did serve as a training ground. It was quite short. It's the one that always appears in the history books of the modernization of Russia. So I think the Cherepanov railway was an effective, functioning industrial railway, you know, the sort of thing that you'd want to move stuff around an ironworks. The St. Petersburg Tsarskoye Selo was basically, you know, this is what a railway looks like. Don't be afraid of it. But the Moscow St. Petersburg was going to be the longest railway in the world when it was finished. There is a story that it's nearly all of it straight, apart from one bit where there's a curve, and that this was because when the Tsar got his ruler out to show where it would run, the pencil went over his thumb. And his engineer said, if that's where the Tsar wants it, that's where it's going to go. I don't believe that's true. It probably says more about Western views of Russian autocracy, but the Tsar got quite interested in railways, put it like that.
There's a question in the middle down Yeah. Can you just wait for the mic because there are people online? Thanks.
Thanks. Hello, Mark Blackett Ord. Wondering about the source of the capital and so forth. I wonder how much the early railway companies were descended, as it were, from the turnpike trusts, which I imagine by the late 18th century had pretty well done their stuff, but had established the precedent of private acts of parliament, which would enable you to drive well, what do you think about this?
I think the private act of parliament is a very important point because it made it much, much easier in the United Kingdom for individuals to get money together, landed gentlemen for the most part. They could go to a banker because they were very well represented in the House of Commons and then the House of Lords. If it were a sensible scheme, it would be taken very seriously. Now, to what extent investment in turnpike trusts in any way gets transferred or the same bankers invest in railways, I don't know. It would be very interesting to know. Of course, in many cases, canal acts are responsible for railway building because those permission to build a tributary railway to a canal. So railways start being built by parliamentary authority on the back of canal acts. Until I suppose the mid-1830s, there was some reason to believe that the stagecoaches could compete with the railways. And when the book was at an early stage, one of the referees made the interesting point that there are a great many nostalgic novels from the 1830s and the 1840s about stagecoach travel. The idea being, I think, that people regarded the stagecoach as a means by which at least the moneyed elite could be brought together, and the United Kingdom strengthened its different identities. People could get to know each other. You didn't have to mingle with the common herd, and that the railway was going to take that process just a step too far and take it down a few notches socially, which of course is what happened. And I'm sure that's one of the, well, Metternich took the same view, and Tsar Nicholas will have taken the same view.
Thank you.
There's a question down the front corner here.
Can you say something, please, about the way in which flanged wheels as a technology spread? And can you tell us whether it's correlated, I mean, was there a correlation with the move from wood to iron rails? I imagine as you got to heavier rolling stock with iron, then certainly you would need flanged wheels. But I'd be interested to know how it came along before that.
I'll do my best. Wooden flanged wheels, such as on the Newcastle wagonways, had flat running surfaces. Some early iron railways had double flanged wheels with flat running surfaces. When you're running at anything like speed, it makes much more sense to cone the wheels. So in other words, they're broader towards the middle of the vehicle, as well as put flanges on them. And when a railway is properly laid and operated, the flanges barely touch the rails. When you hear a train making a squealing noise when it goes around a curve, that's because the flanges are doing their bit. So the technology of the coned wheel and the coning on the top of the rail is very, very complicated. But it seems to have come into being without much discussion, at least that I've been able to establish, in the 1830s. But who first sits down and says, we will cone our wheels, not altogether clear. But again, it's the Stephensons and the rest of them who come to this conclusion. And by 1836, for instance, or 1834, the Festiniog Railway, my railway in North Wales, is being built to an incredibly high standard. You might think an obscure North Walian horse and gravity railway, but it's built in such a way that the gradients just get slightly steeper before it goes into a curve to carry these coned wheels through the curves at the same speed. So I'm putting my money between 1830 and 1834, but the process is a bit obscure, at least to me.
I think, um,
I wondered, do you see an almost eternal future for the railways? Obviously, Dr. Beeching didn't some while ago, and his ideas have been very much overturned. I wonder how you see the future in this country and maybe overseas, different developments taking place.
It seems to me that railways always come back into their own when fuel is expensive, whether it's hay for horses, and so you get less rolling resistance on a railway than on a road, or when we're talking about oil. So I personally think that the railway has a glorious future ahead of it, and we can now run trains, well, not me personally, or the Festiniog Railway, you understand, but trains can be run, let's say, from China to Spain. You've got all sorts of things like axles that can change the gauge of vehicles when they're on the move. So, yeah, the railway's where it's at.
That's probably a very fitting moment to express our thanks to David for not only an excellent lecture, but you can see the depth of learning and understanding coming through in the questions. Can we express our thanks in normal?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I give notice that the next meeting of the Society will be on Thursday, the 29th of February 2024, when we will hear a paper, Mudlarking Lost and Found on the River Thames, by Lara Maitland. Meetings